March 17, 1943, North Atlantic. 52 degran, 31 degrees DW. The U-boat rolled in heavy seas, its steel hull creaking against the pressure of waves that swept across the conning tower in walls of grey water. Inside the cramped control room, Kapitän Lieutenant Werner Schulze pressed oil-stained charts against the navigation table, his fingers tracing convoy routes that had become increasingly dangerous, increasingly crowded with enemy escorts. Through the periscope, in the brief moments when visibility allowed, he had counted them, the destroyer silhouettes on the horizon, lean predatory shapes that multiplied with every passing week. 7 escorts for a convoy that 6 months earlier would have rated 3. And these were not the old flush-deckers that the British had been scraping together since 1939, those worn-out relics from the last war that could barely maintain patrol speed. These were new ships, American ships, built with a speed that defied everything Schulze had learned about naval construction during his years in the Kriegsmarine. He had read the intelligence briefings with disbelief, had dismissed them as Allied propaganda designed to demoralize U-boat crews. But now, looking through the periscope at destroyers that had not existed 90 days ago, he understood that the reports were not propaganda. They were warning. America had done something that no naval power in history had accomplished. It had industrialized naval warfare, had transformed shipbuilding from a craft into mass production, had created a system so efficient that it could produce complex warships faster than Germany could sink them. The laughter had stopped. In the officers' mess at Lorient, in the crew quarters at Saint-Nazaire, in the planning rooms where U-boat commanders gathered to share intelligence and celebrate kills, the confidence that had characterized the early war years had evaporated. The happy time, they had called it, Die glückliche Zeit, those months in 1940 and 1941, when U-boats had ranged freely across the Atlantic, sinking Allied merchantmen faster than they could be replaced, when convoys had been lightly escorted and poorly defended, when it seemed inevitable that the submarine blockade would strangle Britain into submission. But by March 1943, the happy time was a memory, replaced by something far grimmer. The hunters had become the hunted. The predators were now prey. And the primary reason, the overwhelming factor that had shifted the balance of the Battle of the Atlantic, was America's ability to build warships at a rate that made sustained U-boat operations mathematically impossible. This industrial capacity, this productive power that could generate 50 destroyers in 90 days, represented something more profound than mere numerical superiority. It represented a fundamental difference in how societies organized themselves for war, how they mobilized resources, how they understood the relationship between industrial capacity and military outcome. Germany had entered the war with a naval construction program designed for quality over quantity, building sophisticated submarines that were technological marvels, complex machines requiring skilled labor and months of careful assembly. America had responded with a different philosophy entirely: standardization, prefabrication, assembly line techniques adapted from automobile manufacturing, a system that prioritized speed and volume over individual ship sophistication. The result was a production differential so extreme that it doomed German naval strategy before the strategic implications were fully understood by Kriegsmarine leadership. But to comprehend what this meant to the men in U-boats, to understand why the laughter stopped, one must first grasp what they had expected, what they had been promised, and how thoroughly American industrial power shattered those expectations. German naval strategy in 1939 rested on calculations that seemed reasonable given historical precedent. U-boats had nearly won World War I, had come dangerously close to starving Britain into surrender before American entry, and the convoy system had turned the tide. The lessons of that earlier conflict shaped German thinking. Submarines, properly employed in wolfpack tactics, could sink merchant tonnage faster than it could be replaced. severing Britain's maritime lifelines, forcing capitulation without the need for costly surface fleet engagements or amphibious invasions. Admiral Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm, had calculated that sinking 700,000 tons of Allied shipping per month would achieve this goal, would reduce British imports below the threshold necessary to sustain both civilian population and military operations. This calculation was not unreasonable. It was grounded in solid analysis of British import requirements, maritime tonnage availability, and historical sinking rates from the previous war. What it failed to account for, what no German planner adequately anticipated, was American shipbuilding capacity once that capacity was fully mobilized for war production. The assumption, embedded in German strategic planning, was that America might eventually build ships to replace losses, but that the construction would be slow, measured in traditional naval timeframes, where a destroyer took 18 months to 2 years from keel laying to commissioning, where Liberty ships would require similar extended construction periods, where American production would be limited by the same resource, constraints and skilled labor shortages that limited German production. These assumptions were catastrophically wrong. When U-boats began their campaign in earnest in 1940, achieving kills that exceeded even optimistic projections, there was genuine belief among U-boat crews that victory was achievable. The tonnage figures were undeniable. Merchant ships were going down faster than they could be replaced. Convoy losses were mounting. British import levels were declining. In the first 6 months of 1942 alone, U-boats sank over 500 Allied ships, totaling more than 2.5 million tons. These were not marginal victories. These were potentially war-winning achievements if the trend continued. U-boat commanders returned to French bases as heroes, their successes celebrated in newsreels, their tonnage totals announced with pride. The enlisted crews pressed into steel tubes for weeks at a time, enduring conditions of incredible hardship and danger, took solace in the belief that their sacrifices were producing strategic results, that they were winning the war's most critical battle. And then America entered the conflict, and the numbers began to change in ways that seemed impossible. American naval construction in World War II represents one of the most remarkable industrial achievements in human history. When full war production began in 1942, American shipyards were building destroyers, destroyer escorts, and other naval vessels at rates that staggered contemporary observers and continue to impress historians today. The 50 destroyers in 90 days figure, which appeared in German intelligence reports and was initially dismissed as propaganda, was not only accurate but actually understated the full scale of American production. Between 1942 and 1945, American shipyards produced 349 destroyers, 420 destroyer escorts, 203 submarines, and tens of thousands of landing craft and auxiliary vessels. But raw numbers alone do not capture the significance. What mattered was the rate, the acceleration, the systematic application of mass production techniques to naval construction. The symbolic object that embodied this production miracle was the destroyer escort, the DE in naval designation. These were smaller, simpler, cheaper vessels than fleet destroyers, designed specifically for convoy escort duty, optimized for anti-submarine warfare, stripped of capabilities unnecessary for their primary mission. A destroyer escort displaced about 2,400 tons compared to 2,100 tons for a fleet destroyer. It carried fewer guns, less sophisticated fire control systems, simpler propulsion machinery. But it carried everything necessary to hunt and kill submarines: sonar, depth charges, hedgehog anti-submarine mortars, sufficient speed to run down surfaced U-boats, and enough endurance to escort convoys across the Atlantic. And America was building them with a speed that defied naval tradition and German comprehension. The key was prefabrication. Rather than building ships sequentially, piece by piece in a shipyard, American manufacturers built ship sections in factories, transported those sections to assembly yards, and welded them together in days rather than months. Engines were built in one location, weapon systems in another, hull sections in multiple factories, all designed to precise specifications that allowed interchangeability. The system was modular, standardized, designed for workers who had never built ships before, women who had been secretaries, men who had been farmers, African Americans migrating from the South to industrial cities, all trained in specific tasks that could be completed quickly without requiring traditional shipbuilding skills. Kaiser shipyards in California became legendary for this approach. Henry Kaiser, who had never built ships before the war, applied techniques he had learned building dams and highways to naval construction. His yards employed assembly line methods, prefabrication, welding instead of riveting, continuous workflow optimization. The result was production times that shrank from 18 months to 12 months to 6 months to, in some record-setting cases, less than 3 months from keel laying to commissioning. And Kaiser was not alone. Shipyards in New Jersey, Maine, Pennsylvania, Texas, and Washington adopted similar methods, created similar efficiencies, produced similar results. By 1943, destroyer escorts were entering service faster than U-boats could sink them, much faster. The mathematics of attrition, which had favored Germany in 1941 and early 1942, shifted decisively. Each U-boat sunk represented months of construction, weeks of crew training, irreplaceable skilled workers, and specialized materials. Each destroyer escort sunk, and U-boats did sink some of them, was replaced in weeks, sometimes days if a vessel had been completed but not yet commissioned. The exchange rate became unsustainable. Germany needed to sink escorts faster than America could build them. Instead, America was building escorts faster than Germany could build U-boats to attack them, and simultaneously building hunter-killer, groups specifically designed to seek out and destroy submarines before they could reach convoy routes. The psychological impact of this production differential on U-boat crews was profound and cumulative. It developed not in a single moment of revelation, but through a gradual, grinding realization that appeared in intelligence briefings, in operational experience, in the increasing difficulty of finding convoys that were not heavily escorted, in the rising casualty rates among U-boats that ventured into the North Atlantic. Korvettenkapitan Peter Kremer, commander of U-333, recorded in his war diary, portions of which were recovered and translated after the war, his reaction to an encounter in April 1943. We located convoy HX-233, 40 merchantmen, and prepared to attack, but the escort screen was impossible. I counted 9 destroyers, 4 corvettes, 2 destroyer escorts we could not identify, and aircraft overhead continuously. 9 destroyers for 1 convoy! 6 months ago, this same convoy would have rated 3 escorts, perhaps 4. Now they travel in moving fortresses, surrounded by ships we cannot penetrate, hunted by aircraft that force us to remain submerged, where we are slow and nearly blind. I reported the situation to headquarters and was ordered to attack regardless of escort strength. We attempted an approach and were detected immediately. Depth charged for 3 hours, sustained damage to diving planes and stern torpedo tubes. We sank nothing. The convoy proceeded without loss. This is the new reality. They are building escorts faster than we can count them, let alone sink them. This new reality manifested in statistics that told a story of systematic defeat. In 1942, U-boats sank 1,150 Allied ships. In 1943, that number dropped to 463 ships. In 1944, it fell to 132. Meanwhile, U-boat losses accelerated in the opposite direction. In 1942, Germany lost 87 U-boats. In 1943, losses reached 237 boats, more than twice the loss rate, with each boat taking experienced crews to the bottom. In 1944, another 242 U-boats were destroyed. By war's end, Of the approximately 1,150 U-boats commissioned by the Kriegsmarine, 785 had been destroyed, and 28,000 of the 40,000 men who served in U-boats had been killed, a 70% mortality rate, the highest of any military branch in any nation during World War II. These were not abstractions to the men serving in U-boats. These were friends, comrades, entire crews who simply never returned from patrol. The boat that departed Lorient alongside yours would disappear without trace, without distress call, without any indication of what had killed it. Perhaps a destroyer's sonar had found it. Perhaps aircraft had caught it surfaced. Perhaps a hedgehog spread had detonated against its hull, or depth charges had crushed it beyond its test depth. The families would receive telegrams. The crew would be listed as missing, and another boat would be assigned to the empty berth, if one was available, which became increasingly uncertain as construction failed to keep pace with losses. The emotional trajectory of U-boat service shifted from confidence to desperation between 1941 and 1943. Early war. Patrols had been dangerous but promising. Crews believed they were winning, that their sacrifices served a strategic purpose, that British resistance would eventually collapse under the tonnage they were sending to the bottom. By 1943, that belief had eroded. Patrols became survival exercises. The goal was no longer to sink enough tonnage to win the war, but simply to return to base alive, to complete the mission without encountering the destroyer. Screens that now surrounded every valuable target, the American destroyer escorts, the DEs that were being built at a rate of nearly 2 per week at the height of production, became objects of particular dread. They were purpose-built submarine killers, and they were good at their job. Equipped with sonar systems that were continuously improving, armed with depth charges and hedgehogs that could kill submarines without requiring direct overhead passes. Manned by crews who trained specifically and exclusively for anti-submarine warfare, these vessels represented a quantum leap in convoy defense capability. And there were so many of them. Every patrol seemed to encounter more, to face escorts that were newer, better equipped, more aggressive in their prosecution of sonar contacts. The destroyer escorts embodied American industrial philosophy. Good enough. Fast enough, and above all, numerous enough to achieve objectives through sheer quantity. A single DE was not superior to a German U-boat in a one-on-one engagement. The submarine was faster underwater, could dive deeper, carried more potent weapons. But Ds never operated alone. They traveled in groups, coordinated their searches, saturated areas with depth charges, maintained sonar contact through crew rotations that kept fresh operators on watch continuously. The individual ship was not exceptional, but the system, the mass production, the standardized training, the coordinated tactics, the continuous replacement of losses was devastatingly effective. German U-boat commanders recognized this systemic superiority with growing despair. They were not losing to superior German engineering or to individual American ship quality. They were losing to American industrial capacity, to a production system that could generate escorts faster than attacks could be planned, faster than torpedoes could be aimed, faster than tactical innovations could be developed to counter them. Fregattenkapitän Reinhard Hardigan, one of Germany's most successful U-boat commanders, who had famously operated off the American East Coast in early 1942 during Operation Drumbeat, wrote after the war, "We understood by 1943 that we were not fighting the American Navy. We were fighting American industry, and you cannot torpedo a factory. We could sink ships, but they built more. We could kill crews, but they trained more. We could develop better torpedoes, better tactics, better training, and none of it mattered because they simply built more escorts than we had torpedoes to fire at them. It was not war. It was mathematics, and we had lost before we understood we were in an equation we could not solve." This realization that the war had become a mathematical problem that Germany could not solve through tactical excellence or strategic innovation represented a profound psychological defeat that preceded actual military defeat. U-boat crews continued to sail on patrol, continued to attack convoys, continued to fight with courage and skill. But they knew, with increasing certainty, that they were fighting a losing battle, that their efforts would not change the war's outcome, that they were being sent to die, not for victory, but simply because stopping would mean admitting that American industrial power had rendered German naval strategy obsolete. The strategic implications extended far beyond the Battle of the Atlantic. American ability to build destroyers at mass production rates signaled a broader industrial capacity that affected every theater of the war. If America could build 50 destroyers in 90 days, what else could it build? The answer, visible in production statistics that German intelligence gathered but German leadership struggled to accept, was everything. Tanks, aircraft, trucks, artillery pieces, ammunition, all being produced in quantities that dwarfed German production despite Germany's total mobilization and despite the fact that America was simultaneously fighting Japan across the Pacific. In 1943 alone, while building those destroyers, America produced 85,000 aircraft compared to Germany's 25,000. America built 29,000 tanks compared to Germany's 12,000. America manufactured 2.6 million rifles compared to Germany's 1.3 million. These production differentials were not marginal. They were overwhelming. And they meant that every battle, every engagement, every theater of operations would eventually tilt toward American material superiority regardless of German tactical prowess or soldier quality. But the destroyer production numbers carried special significance. For naval warfare and for the Battle of the Atlantic specifically, control of the Atlantic meant control of Britain's supply lines, which meant determining whether Britain could continue fighting, whether American forces could be staged for invasion of Europe, whether the Allied coalition could be maintained. Germany had staked its naval strategy on winning this battle, on using U-boats to sever those supply lines before American production could tip the balance. And America had defeated that strategy not through superior tactics or better naval commanders, but through shipyards that could build escorts faster than U-boats could sink them. The symbolic power of this achievement extended beyond its immediate military utility. The destroyer escorts, multiplying across the Atlantic, represented visible proof of American industrial capacity, tangible evidence that the arsenal of democracy was not propaganda, but reality. Each ship was a statement. We can build these faster than you can destroy them. We can replace every loss. We can escort every convoy. We can dominate this ocean because we dominate industrial production. German naval leadership struggled to develop effective responses. They invested in new U-boat technologies. The type anti-submarine, which was faster underwater and could remain submerged longer, represented a genuine technological leap. But these advanced boats came too late and in too few numbers. They invested in acoustic torpedoes designed to home in on destroyer propeller sounds. But countermeasures were developed, and the fundamental problem remained. There were too many escorts to sink, too many convoys to attack, too much ocean to cover, with too few U-boats facing too many enemies. By mid-1943, Admiral Dönitz faced an impossible dilemma. Continuing the U-boat campaign meant accepting casualty rates that were unsustainable. Boats and crews were being lost faster than they could be replaced. But stopping the campaign meant conceding the Battle of the Atlantic, abandoning Germany's only effective weapon against Allied supply lines, admitting that naval strategy had failed. He chose to continue partly from military necessity, partly from Nazi ideological commitment that refused to acknowledge defeat, partly from the hope that new technologies might shift the balance if they could be deployed quickly enough. They could not. American production continued to accelerate. By late 1943, escort carriers, small aircraft carriers designed specifically to provide air cover for convoys, began entering service in large numbers, adding yet another layer of defense that made U-boat operations even more dangerous. These escort carriers were themselves products of mass production techniques built on merchant ship hulls, equipped with sufficient aircraft to provide continuous air patrols over convoys. Combined with long-range land-based patrol aircraft and the ever-increasing numbers of destroyer escorts, they closed what had been called the Atlantic Gap, the mid-ocean area beyond range of land-based aircraft where U-boats had operated with relative freedom. The noose tightened systematically. Every advantage that U-boats had exploited in 1940 and 1941 was negated by 1943 and 1944. Surface attacks at night, which had been effective against weakly escorted convoys, became suicide missions against the dense destroyer screens and radar-equipped escorts that could detect surfaced submarines at ranges exceeding visual contact. Submerged attacks, which offered better protection, limited U-boat speed and maneuverability so severely that coordinated convoy defense could keep submarines at bay. The wolfpack tactics that had worked when U-boats outnumbered escorts became impossible when every convoy had more escorts than attacking submarines. The experiences of individual U-boat crews during this period reflect the broader strategic collapse. Oberleutnant Suzy Herbert Werner, who served through the war's duration and survived to write a memoir, described a patrol in late 1943. "We spent 21 days at sea and sighted one convoy, which we could not attack because the destroyer screen detected us before we achieved firing position. We were depth-charged on 4 separate occasions, sustained damage twice, and returned to base having accomplished nothing except survival. This was victory in 1943, to return alive. 3 of the boats that departed on patrol with us did not return. We never learned what killed them. One day they were there, broadcasting position reports and sighting contacts. The next day, silence. Boats vanished as if they had never existed. And always there were more American escorts, more destroyers and destroyer escorts and corvettes. A wall of steel between us and our targets. This sense of futility, of engaging in operations that achieved nothing except consuming lives and resources, pervaded U-boat service by 1944. Crews continued to follow orders, continued to sail on patrol, but the motivating belief that their actions might change the war's outcome had vanished. They were going through motions, fulfilling duties, dying for a cause they knew was lost. The laughter stopped, not in a single moment, but across thousands of such moments. Patrols that returned with nothing to show. Friends who never returned at all. Intelligence briefings that reported ever-increasing numbers of American escorts. Tactical discussions that produced no viable solutions to the production differential. The joke that had sustained morale, that U-boats were winning the tonnage war, that Britain would starve. That American industrial capacity was exaggerated propaganda, became obviously false, painfully false, deadly false. And without that joke, without the belief that suffering served purpose, U-boat service became simple endurance, waiting to die or waiting for the war to end, whichever came first. American destroyer escorts continued to roll off production lines through 1944 and into 1945. By war's end, over 400 had been commissioned, along with the hundreds of fleet destroyers and thousands of smaller escort vessels. These ships formed the backbone of convoy defense, the shield that protected Allied supply lines, the wall that U-boats could not penetrate. They represented not just American industrial capacity, but American strategic vision, the understanding that wars are won not just by destroying enemies, but by protecting friends. Not just by offensive action, but by defensive capability so strong that enemy offensive action becomes ineffective. Men who served on these destroyer escorts rarely received the recognition given to aircraft carriers or battleships. They operated in the most dangerous waters, hunting submarines that could kill them with a single torpedo, enduring Atlantic storms that could break ships in half, maintaining patrols that lasted weeks without rest or relief. But they won the Battle of the Atlantic through persistence and presence. By being there, by being numerous enough that every convoy had protection, by being capable enough that U-boats could not operate freely, by embodying American industrial power in steel hulls that said, "We can build faster than you can destroy. We can protect what matters. We can win through the simple expedient of having more." The German crews who faced these vessels understood what they represented, not individual ship quality. Some destroyer escorts had mechanical problems, some crews were poorly trained, some vessels never achieved full operational capability. But the system they represented was flawless in its logic. Build enough, deploy enough, protect enough, and eventually the enemy cannot win. Cannot sink enough tonnage, cannot sustain operations, cannot replace losses, cannot maintain belief that sacrifice serves purpose. By early 1945, U-boat operations had effectively ceased to matter strategically. Boats still sailed, still attempted attacks, still occasionally sank merchant ships or escorts. But the tonnage totals were insignificant compared to what was being built. The Battle of the Atlantic was over. Germany had lost, and the primary weapon in that defeat was American shipbuilding capacity. The ability to produce destroyers and destroyer escorts at rates that made sustained submarine warfare mathematically impossible. There is a moment, recorded in multiple accounts from different U-boat crews, that captures the emotional core of this defeat. It occurred at various times on different boats, but the pattern was consistent. A U-boat would surface at night to recharge batteries and get fresh air into the hull after days submerged. The watch officer would scan the horizon with binoculars, looking for targets, for threats, for anything worth reporting. And he would see in the distance lights, not warship lights. Those would trigger immediate crash dive. But convoy lights, merchant ships steaming along, lit up like cities, completely unconcerned about submarine threats because they were surrounded by escorts so numerous that no U-boat commander would dare attack. The watch officer would call the captain. They would observe this impossible sight, convoys so confident in their protection that they sailed illuminated, visible for miles, daring submarines to attack knowing the escorts would destroy any boat foolish enough to try. This image, convoys sailing with lights burning while U-boats hid in darkness, inverted everything that U-boat warfare was supposed to be. Submarines were supposed to be the hunters, striking from darkness, invisible and deadly. Convoys were supposed to be the hunted, traveling blacked out, hoping to avoid detection, vulnerable and fearful. But by 1945, the roles had reversed. Convoys sailed openly. U-boats hid. The hunters had become the hunted, because the hunted had deployed so many hunters that hunting became impossible. That reversal, visible in illuminated convoys surrounded by destroyer screens, embodied the mathematical defeat that American production had imposed. You cannot win when your enemy builds faster than you can destroy. You cannot sustain operations when every mission faces overwhelming opposition. You cannot maintain morale when every patrol demonstrates your strategic irrelevance. The laughter stops when the joke becomes your own death. When courage and skill and sacrifice achieve nothing except consuming lives for no purpose except delaying inevitable defeat. The destroyer escorts that accomplish this, those mass-produced, standardized good enough warships became monuments to industrial power as strategic weapon. They were not individually impressive. They were not technological marvels. They were not the kind of ships that naval architects celebrated or historians romanticized. They were simply effective and, above all, numerous. Numerous enough to escort every convoy. Numerous enough to hunt every submarine. Numerous enough to prove that quantity has a quality all its own when that quantity reaches levels that overwhelm enemy capacity to respond. This lesson, learned in blood in the North Atlantic, resonated beyond naval warfare. It suggested that modern war was fundamentally about production, about which society could mobilize resources more effectively, about which industrial system could generate materiel faster. Germany had built a military machine designed for quick victories, for tactical excellence, for quality over quantity. America had built a military machine designed for sustained conflict, for strategic endurance, for quantity sufficient to achieve overwhelming advantage. When those two philosophies collided, the American approach won because it could replace losses, because it could learn from defeats, because it could build faster than the enemy could destroy. The German U-boat crews who served through this transition, who experienced the shift from happy time to desperate survival, who saw convoys transform from vulnerable targets to protected fortresses, understood this truth at a visceral level. They had been sent to win a war by sinking ships. Instead, they discovered that the ships they sank were replaced faster than they could be counted, that the escorts hunting them multiplied beyond any ability to evade them, that American production had rendered their entire strategic purpose obsolete before they fully grasped what was happening. In May 1945, when Germany surrendered, approximately 156 U-boats were at sea. They were ordered to surface, to broadcast their positions, to proceed to designated ports and surrender. Most complied. Some scuttled themselves rather than surrender. A few attempted to escape to neutral nations. But the result was the same. The U-boat campaign ended not with a final glorious battle, but with scattered boats surfacing, alone and defeated, surrounded by oceans that had become American-controlled waters, protected by destroyer screens that no longer needed to fear submarine attack because the submarines had lost. Comprehensively and mathematically, the crews that surrendered, that were taken prisoner, that survived to reflect on what they had experienced, carried with them the knowledge of what American industrial power meant. They had seen it manifested in steel hulls, in destroyer escorts that appeared faster than they could be sunk, in convoy screens that thickened until penetration was impossible, in a production system that had treated naval warfare as a manufacturing problem and solved it through mass production techniques that no traditional naval power had imagined possible. This knowledge, this understanding of American industrial capacity, shaped post-war German consciousness in ways that paralleled the POW experience. Germany had fought a nation that could build 50 destroyers in 90 days, while simultaneously fighting a two-front war while maintaining civilian prosperity. The implications were inescapable. America possessed resources, organizational capacity, and productive efficiency that Germany could not match, had never been able to match, had been delusional to challenge. The Nazi propaganda that had portrayed America as weak and divided and culturally inferior had been catastrophically wrong, and 30,000 dead U-boat crewmen had paid for that wrongness with their lives. The destroyer escorts themselves, those utilitarian vessels built with such remarkable speed, became historical artifacts that testified to this industrial triumph. Many survived the war, serving in Allied navies for decades, some remaining operational into the 1990s. They were not graceful ships. They were not powerful ships in the way that battleships or carriers were powerful. But they were effective ships, and they were built in numbers sufficient to change the war's outcome, to protect Allied supply lines, to defeat the U-boat campaign, to prove that industrial capacity was the foundation of modern military power. The symbolic weight of these vessels extended beyond their immediate military utility. They represented American economic organization, American productive philosophy, American willingness to apply industrial methods to military problems. They demonstrated that democracy and capitalism, when mobilized for total war, could outproduce authoritarian systems despite the supposed deficiencies of centralized control. They proved that free societies could organize themselves for conflict as effectively as dictatorships, that individual initiative and decentralized decision-making could generate better results than top-down command. Structures, when properly channeled toward common goals. The U-boat crews who faced these vessels learned these lessons through direct painful experience. Each encounter with expanded escort screens taught them that American production exceeded German capacity. Each friend who failed to return from patrol demonstrated that the casualty exchange rate favored America. Each intelligence briefing reporting new destroyer commissionings reinforced that the war was being lost not through tactical failures, but through strategic impossibility. They could not sink ships faster than America built them. They could not kill sailors faster than America trained them. They could not develop technologies faster than America could counter them with sheer numbers. And so the laughter stopped. Stopped in officer messes, where tonnage totals no longer produced celebration because the totals were no longer strategically significant. Stopped in crew quarters, where each patrol became survival exercise rather than hunting mission. Stopped in strategic planning sessions, where every proposed operation confronted the same insurmountable obstacle. Too many escorts, too few submarines, mathematics that permitted no solution except defeat. The silence that replaced laughter was the sound of understanding dawning, of recognition that the war was lost, that sacrifice had become meaningless except as duty, that courage and skill could not overcome industrial production differentials that measured in orders of magnitude. It was the silence of men who had been sent to accomplish the impossible and had learned, too late, that it had always been impossible. That American capacity had rendered German strategy obsolete before the first patrol boat left harbor. That they had been fighting not an enemy they might defeat, but an industrial system that would inevitably grind them into irrelevance. This was why the laughter stopped. Not because of a single defeat or a particular battle, but because of 50 destroyers in 90 days, because of production lines that never stopped, because of a nation so wealthy and so organized that it could build warships faster than they could be sunk, because of an industrial system that had solved warfare through manufacturing, that had transformed combat into a production problem, and then solved that problem with assembly line efficiency that made traditional naval warfare obsolete. The destroyer escorts remain, even now, symbols of this transformation. Most were scrapped after the war, their steel recycled, their histories forgotten by general populations. But their achievement endures in the historical record, in the Battle of the Atlantic statistics that show decisive Allied victory after 1943, in the survival of convoys that carried the supplies that sustained Britain and enabled D-Day and supported the advance into Germany. They were the shield that protected Allied logistics, the wall that U-boats could not penetrate, the manifestation of American industrial power as strategic weapon. And they were built, 50 of them, in 90 days. Built by workers who had never built ships before. Built in yards that applied automobile manufacturing techniques to naval construction. Built through prefabrication and standardization and relentless optimization of production processes. Built faster than any nation in history had built warships. Built in numbers sufficient to win the Battle of the Atlantic, to defeat the U-boat campaign, to prove that modern war belonged to whoever could produce more, faster, better. The German U-boat crews understood this. Finally, when understanding came too late to matter, they understood that they had been fighting American industry, not American Navy, that they had been engaged in a war they could not win because winning required sinking ships faster than they could be built, and American shipyards had made that impossible. That the laughter, the confidence, the belief in victory that had sustained them through early war successes had been founded on false assumptions about American capacity, assumptions that were shattered by the reality of destroyers that appeared in numbers that made submarine warfare obsolete. This is what 50 destroyers in 90 days meant. Not just numerical superiority, not just industrial capacity, but the systematic defeat of an enemy strategy through production so rapid and so efficient that tactical excellence became irrelevant, that courage and skill could not overcome numerical disadvantage, that the very best soldiers and sailors and commanders were rendered ineffective by facing an opponent who could simply build more weapons than they could destroy. The laughter stopped Because the joke was on Germany, because the U-boat crews had been sent to win the impossible, because American shipyards had transformed naval warfare into mass production, and mass production into strategic victory, and strategic victory into the silence that descended over U-boat bases, where boats departed and never returned, where crews sailed knowing they would probably die, where the mathematics of attrition had become so unfavorable that operations continued only because stopping would mean admitting defeat before the formal surrender that everyone knew was coming. In that silence, in that absence of laughter, in that knowledge of inevitable defeat, the destroyer escorts sailed on, protecting convoys, hunting submarines, embodying American industrial power as weapon of war, built in 90 days, deployed in numbers that made victory inevitable, proving that the future belonged not to those who fought hardest, but to those who built fastest, that modern warfare was fundamentally about production, and that America had mastered production in ways that made German resistance tragic but ultimately futile. This was the truth that the destroyer escorts carried in their steel hulls, the lesson written in their mass-produced, standardized construction, the reality that U-boat crews learned through bitter experience, that abundance defeats scarcity, that production overwhelms tactics, that industrial capacity determines strategic outcomes, regardless of individual courage or sacrifice or skill. The laughter stopped because that truth became undeniable, inescapable, deadly. And in its place came the silence of defeat, the quiet acceptance that the war was over, even before the formal surrender, that American shipyards had won the Battle of the Atlantic by building faster than Germany could destroy, by producing evidence, 50 destroyers in 90 days, that the arsenal of democracy was not propaganda but reality, not hope but fact, not promise but steel hulls, multiplying across an ocean that had become American water, protected by American ships, controlled by American power that was founded not on military genius, but on industrial capacity that no enemy could match, no strategy could defeat, no sacrifice could overcome.